The confrontation between a vice president and a congresswoman wasn't just a personal argument. JD Vance's words, "You don't belong in this room," and Jasmine Crockett's legendary response reignited America's debate on systemic racism. The windowless conference room on the third floor of the Dirksen Senate office building had hosted thousands of routine briefings over the decades. Government officials, congressional members, and policy advisors had gathered in that beige-walled space to discuss everything from agricultural subsidies to defense spending. On this particular Tuesday morning in March, what was supposed to be a standard bipartisan infrastructure briefing would become one of the most explosive political moments in recent American history. Representative Jasmine Crockett arrived at the Capitol that morning with her usual meticulous preparation. Her briefcase contained detailed maps showing federal fund allocation disparities, statistical breakdowns of infrastructure failures in minority communities, and specific case studies from her district in Texas. She had spent weeks preparing for this closed-door meeting, knowing it might be her only chance to directly address Vice President JD Vance about the systematic neglect of Black and Latino communities in federal infrastructure spending. The briefing was scheduled to cover routine infrastructure allocations, roads, bridges, water systems, and broadband expansion. Present were a handful of key lawmakers from both chambers, including some of the most powerful voices in Congress. The usual setup: water bottles, briefing folders, nameplates arranged around a polished oak conference table. Vice President Vance sat at the head of the table, flanked by his policy advisors and transportation department officials. For the first hour, the discussion proceeded predictably. Charts were displayed showing national infrastructure needs, budget projections were reviewed, and various senators and representatives asked technical questions about implementation timelines. The atmosphere was cordial, professional, the kind of insider meeting where real policy gets shaped away from cameras and public scrutiny. Then, Jasmine Crockett raised her hand. "Mr. Vice President," she began, her voice measured and professional, "I'd like to address some concerning patterns I've identified in our current allocation methodology." Vance nodded absently, expecting another routine policy question. "Certainly, Representative Crockett." Jasmine opened her folder and pulled out the first of her carefully prepared documents. "According to the data I've compiled from the Department of Transportation and various state agencies, there's a significant disparity in how federal infrastructure funds are being distributed. Specifically, I'm seeing a pattern where predominantly white higher-income districts are receiving disproportionate funding compared to communities of color facing the most severe infrastructure crises." The room's energy shifted slightly. This wasn't the usual technical discussion about asphalt specifications and bridge engineering standards. "For example," Jasmine continued, consulting her notes, "Jackson, Mississippi, a city with a majority Black population, has been dealing with a water crisis for years. Their water treatment facilities are failing, residents have been under boil water advisories, and the estimated cost to fix the system is around $2 billion. Meanwhile, in the same time period, predominantly white suburban districts in states like Nebraska and Iowa have received substantial federal grants for projects like decorative street lighting and recreational bike paths." Senator Patricia Rawlings from Nebraska shifted uncomfortably in her seat. A few policy advisors began taking more careful notes. Jasmine was just getting started. "In Louisiana, specifically Iberia Parish, we have communities that have been without reliable electricity for months following storm damage. The power grid infrastructure is from the 1960s, and residents, mostly Black and Latino families, are still waiting for federal assistance that was promised 18 months ago. But during that same period, whiter, wealthier parishes have received millions in federal funds for broadband expansion and highway beautification projects." She spread out a detailed map showing funding allocations across the Gulf Coast. "I can show you the exact zip codes, the demographic breakdowns, and the funding disparities. This isn't speculation. This is documented federal spending data." The room had grown noticeably quieter. Vice President Vance's expression had hardened slightly, though he maintained his political composure. Representative Crockett, he said, his tone carrying a slight edge. These allocation decisions are based on complex criteria, including project readiness, environmental impact assessments, state matching funds, and numerous other technical factors. It's not appropriate to reduce these sophisticated policy frameworks to simple demographic comparisons. Jasmine didn't miss a beat. I understand the complexity, Mr. Vice President. That's exactly why I've spent months analyzing those same criteria. And what I've found is that the very frameworks you're referring to contain built-in biases that systematically disadvantage communities of color. She pulled out another document. Project readiness requirements, for instance, often favor communities that already have the resources to hire expensive consulting firms and navigate bureaucratic processes. Environmental impact assessments frequently take longer in areas where residents don't have the political connections to expedite reviews. State matching fund requirements disproportionately impact states with smaller tax bases, which often correlate with higher populations of color. The temperature in the room seemed to rise. Several participants were now paying close attention to what was becoming less of a policy discussion and more of a systematic critique of federal spending priorities. What I'm asking, Jasmine continued, is how this administration plans to address these documented disparities. How do we justify spending millions on aesthetic improvements in wealthy suburbs while American citizens in places like Jackson, Mississippi, can't safely drink their tap water? Senator Robert Harbridge from Iowa, clearly irritated, interjected. Representative Crockett, I think you're cherry-picking data to support a predetermined narrative. Infrastructure spending isn't about racial politics. It's about economic efficiency and practical implementation. Jasmine turned to face him directly. Senator Harbridge, I'd be happy to discuss cherry-picking data. According to my research, your state received a 23% increase in discretionary infrastructure grants over the past 2 years, while states with higher percentages of minority populations saw an average decrease of 12%. Would you like me to provide the specific funding breakdown for your district? Harbridge's face reddened, but before he could respond, Jasmine continued. And regarding economic efficiency, it's hard to argue that decorative streetlights in suburbs represent a better economic investment than providing clean drinking water to major American cities. The tension in the room was now unmistakable. This was no longer a routine briefing. It was becoming a direct challenge to the administration's spending priorities, and by extension, its commitment to racial equity. Vice President Vance, who had been listening with growing impatience, finally decided to assert his authority. He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the tone of someone accustomed to ending uncomfortable conversations. Representative Crockett, he said, his words cutting through the room's tension like a blade, you don't belong in this room. The silence that followed was surgical in its precision. It sliced the space into before and after, creating a moment that everyone present would remember for the rest of their political careers. Even the aide taking notes paused mid-sentence, her pen hovering over the legal pad as the weight of what had just been said settled over the room. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice or pound the table. She didn't stammer or shift in her seat. She simply sat there for approximately 2 seconds, absorbing the vice president's words, processing their implications, and formulating her response with the precision of the skilled attorney she had been before entering politics. When she spoke, her voice was soft but carried clearly to every corner of the room. Mr. Vice President, I was elected by over 700,000 Americans who live every day with the consequences of the decisions made in this room. If I don't belong here, then neither do the people you swore to serve. The silence that followed was even more profound than the first. It wasn't just awkward. It was the kind of quiet that occurs when fundamental power structures are suddenly exposed and challenged. In that moment, every person in the room understood they had just witnessed something that would extend far beyond the confines of that beige conference room. Senator Polly McAllister from Maine, who had built her reputation on always having something to say in these meetings, simply stared down at her phone, tapping the screen but not typing anything. Representative Joanna Beckley, also from Maine, finally broke the silence. You realize, she said quietly, You just told a sitting member of Congress that she doesn't belong here, right? Vance, his arms crossed defensively, replied with a tone that suggested he wasn't backing down. She questioned our framework in a way that sounded more like a campaign speech than a policy concern. Beckley raised her eyebrows. Or maybe she just reminded you that your framework's blind spots aren't invisible anymore. Someone near the door mumbled something about taking a recess. Another senator stood up and left without saying anything, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the meeting had taken. But Jasmine Crockett remained seated, her folder still open, her documents still spread across the table. She hadn't come this far to be dismissed by 6 words from a vice president who seemed to have forgotten that he worked for the American people, not the other way around. "Mr. Vice President," she said, her voice regaining its professional tone, "I understand that discussing racial disparities in federal spending makes some people uncomfortable. But my constituents, the 700,000 Americans who sent me here, don't have the luxury of being uncomfortable. They live with failing infrastructure every day. They boil their water because their government has failed them. They drive on dangerous roads because their zip codes don't qualify for federal improvements." She gestured to the document spread before her. "These aren't campaign talking points. These are the lived realities of American citizens who pay taxes, vote in elections, and deserve better from their government. If acknowledging that reality means I don't belong in this room, then this room has a fundamental problem." The confrontation might have ended there, with both sides retreating to their respective corners, but what happened next transformed a policy disagreement into a historic moment. One of Vance's own policy advisors, a young woman named Sarah Chen, who had been quietly taking notes, whispered something in his ear. He brushed her off, his eyes still locked on Jasmine. But the damage was done. The optics were terrible, and everyone in the room knew it. Representative Marcus Williams from Georgia, one of the few other black members present, finally spoke up. "I think what Representative Crockett is raising deserves serious consideration. The data she's presenting is compelling, and the disparities she's highlighting affect communities across the country." Senator Patricia Rawlings, despite being from one of the states Jasmine had criticized, added, "I may not agree with all of Representative Crockett's conclusions, but I respect her right to raise these concerns. That's what we're here for." The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, but the real conversation was over. The vice president's 6 words had fundamentally altered the dynamic, and everyone present understood that what had happened in that room wouldn't stay in that room. As the meeting adjourned, Jasmine gathered her papers methodically. She didn't rush, didn't avoid eye contact, didn't offer forced pleasantries. She stood up, collected her materials, and walked toward the door with the dignity of someone who knew she had spoken truth to power, regardless of the consequences. In the hallway, her chief of staff, Andre Lynn, caught up with her. "You want to address what just happened?" he asked quietly. "No," she replied without hesitation. "Let them sit with it." But sitting with it wasn't an option for long. Within hours, word of the exchange began leaking out. It started with careful whispers among congressional staff, then moved to text messages between reporters who had sources in the room. By that evening, multiple news organizations were working to confirm the details of what had transpired in that closed-door briefing. The leak came from an unexpected source, Sarah Chen, the policy advisor who had tried to warn Vance during the meeting. Troubled by what she had witnessed and concerned about the precedent it set, she reached out to a reporter at Politico with whom she had developed a professional relationship. "I can't be quoted by name," she told the reporter over a secure phone line, "but you need to know what happened in that infrastructure briefing today. The vice president told a sitting congresswoman that she didn't belong in the room, a black congresswoman who was presenting documented evidence of racial disparities in federal spending." The reporter, Marcus Washington, recognized the significance immediately. "Can you provide more details about the context? What exactly was Representative Crockett discussing when this happened?" Chen provided a detailed account of Jasmine's presentation, the data she had presented, and the exact sequence of events that led to Vance's comment. She also described the reaction in the room and Jasmine's powerful response. By Wednesday morning, the story was everywhere. Politico's headline read, "Exclusive. Vice President told Black Congresswoman, "You don't belong in this room," during infrastructure briefing. Within hours, every major news organization was following up, seeking confirmation and additional details. The White House's response was swift, but clumsy. Press Secretary Jennifer Martinez attempted damage control during the daily briefing, claiming that the vice president's comment had been taken out of context and that he had simply been trying to redirect the discussion back to substantive policy matters. But the explanation fell flat, particularly when reporters began asking about the specific infrastructure disparities that Jasmine had raised. When asked whether the administration disputed her data about racial disparities in federal spending, Martinez struggled to provide a coherent response. "The administration is committed to equitable infrastructure development," she said, reading from prepared talking points. "All funding decisions are made based on objective criteria and established frameworks." A reporter from CNN followed up, "But doesn't Representative Crockett's data suggest that those objective criteria and established frameworks are producing racially disparate outcomes?" Martinez deflected, "I'd refer you to the Department of Transportation for specific details about infrastructure allocation methodologies." The story gained momentum throughout the day. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from outrage to support. "You don't belong here" began trending, with users sharing their own experiences of being dismissed or marginalized in professional settings. "Stand with Crockett" followed shortly after, as supporters rallied around her principled stand. But the real game changer came when someone, the source was never identified, leaked audio of the exchange. The recording was brief, but devastating. It captured Vance's dismissive tone perfectly, as well as the profound silence that followed Jasmine's response. The audio clip was first posted on Twitter by an anonymous account with no followers and no other posts. Within minutes, it had been shared thousands of times. Within hours, it was being played on every cable news network in America. Hearing the actual exchange was far more powerful than reading about it. Vance's "You don't belong in this room" came across as dismissive and condescending. Jasmine's response, "If I don't belong here, then neither do the people you swore to serve," sounded measured, dignified, and devastatingly effective. The political ramifications were immediate. Democratic leaders rallied to Jasmine's defense, with Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi issuing a statement calling Vance's comment inappropriate and unacceptable. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer demanded an apology and called for a formal investigation into racial disparities in federal infrastructure spending. More surprising was the reaction from some Republican quarters. Senator Susan Collins of Maine, known for her moderate positions, issued a carefully worded statement expressing concern about the tone and content of the vice president's remarks. Even Senator Mitt Romney, typically reluctant to criticize fellow Republicans, suggested that Vance's comment was inappropriate for the setting and the circumstances. The story dominated news cycles for days. Cable networks brought in panels of experts to discuss everything from congressional protocols to the history of racial exclusion in American politics. Academic researchers who had studied infrastructure inequality suddenly found themselves in high demand for television interviews. Dr. Jennifer Adams, a professor of public policy at Howard University who had written extensively about racial disparities in federal spending, appeared on MSNBC to provide context. "What Representative Crockett exposed," she explained, "is a systematic pattern that researchers have been documenting for years. Federal infrastructure spending has consistently favored whiter, wealthier communities over communities of color, even when the need is demonstrably greater in minority areas." The host asked, "So her data was accurate?" "Absolutely," Dr. Adams replied. "The disparities she highlighted in Jackson, Mississippi and Louisiana parishes are well documented. What's remarkable is that she was presenting this information in exactly the form where these issues should be discussed. A closed-door policy briefing with the vice president. The fact that she was told she didn't belong there for raising these concerns speaks to deeper problems in how our government approaches racial equity." International media picked up the story as well. The BBC ran a segment titled "American Democracy Under Scrutiny" that examined the incident as part of broader patterns of racial exclusion in U.S. politics. European newspapers analyzed the exchange as evidence of ongoing tensions over race and representation in American government. But perhaps the most significant reaction came from ordinary Americans, particularly in the communities that Jasmine had been advocating for. In Jackson, Mississippi, residents organized a rally in support of Crockett with signs reading "She Belongs" and "Truth to Power." Similar events were held in New Orleans, Houston, and dozens of other cities with large Black and Latino populations. Maria Gonzalez, a resident of Iberia Parish, Louisiana, told a local news reporter, "That Congresswoman was fighting for us in that room. She was talking about our problems, our needs, and they tried to silence her. But she didn't back down. She spoke for all of us who never get to sit at those tables." The groundswell of support was unprecedented. Jasmine's congressional office was flooded with calls and emails from across the country. Her social media following grew by hundreds of thousands of followers in a matter of days. Most importantly, donations to her campaign and to organizations focused on infrastructure equity poured in from individual contributors nationwide. But Jasmine herself remained focused on the substance rather than the spectacle. In her first public statement following the leak of the audio, she didn't dwell on Vance's comment or her response. Instead, she used the attention to highlight the infrastructure inequities she had been trying to address in the first place. "While I appreciate the support from people across the country," she said in a written statement, "I want to keep the focus on the real issue. The documented disparities in federal infrastructure spending that are leaving communities of color without basic necessities like clean water, reliable electricity, and safe transportation." She announced that she would be introducing comprehensive legislation to address these disparities. The Infrastructure Equity Act would require demographic impact assessments for all federal infrastructure spending, mandate transparent reporting of funding allocations by community demographics, and establish an independent oversight board to ensure equitable distribution of federal resources. The legislation gained immediate support from progressive Democrats and surprising interest from some moderate Republicans who recognized the political danger of opposing infrastructure equity measures in the current climate. Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, typically cautious about progressive initiatives, issued a statement saying he was interested in reviewing Representative Crockett's proposed legislation, and acknowledged that infrastructure needs in rural and minority communities have been neglected for too long. Even more surprising was the response from Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, who announced she would co-sponsor a Senate version of Crockett's bill. "Infrastructure investment should be based on need, not politics or demographics," Murkowski said. "If our current systems are producing discriminatory outcomes, then we need better systems." The momentum continued to build throughout the following weeks. The House Oversight Committee announced it would hold hearings on racial disparities in federal infrastructure spending, with Jasmine scheduled as the lead witness. Major newspapers began investigative series examining infrastructure inequality across the country. The New York Times published a detailed analysis of federal spending patterns that confirmed many of Jasmine's allegations. The Washington Post ran a series called "Infrastructure Apartheid" that documented systematic neglect of minority communities in federal allocation decisions. CNN produced a special report that included interviews with residents of Jackson, Mississippi, and other affected communities. Each new revelation added credibility to Jasmine's original presentation and made Vance's dismissal of her concerns look increasingly problematic. The vice president, who had initially stood by his comments, began facing pressure from within his own party to address the situation more substantively. The turning point came when Republican Senator John Cornyn of Texas, not known for progressive positions on racial issues, called for a comprehensive review of federal infrastructure allocation processes. In a floor speech that surprised many observers, Cornyn acknowledged that patterns of disparity that have been highlighted deserve serious examination, regardless of the political dynamics surrounding how they were brought to our attention. Facing mounting pressure, Vice President Vance finally agreed to a one-on-one meeting with Jasmine to discuss infrastructure equity issues. The meeting, held 3 weeks after the original confrontation, was private, but resulted in a joint statement announcing the formation of a bipartisan working group on infrastructure equity. The statement was carefully worded to avoid any admission of wrongdoing by Vance, but its existence was widely seen as a victory for Jasmine and the communities she represented. The working group would have subpoena power to investigate federal spending patterns and would be empowered to recommend legislative and administrative changes to address documented disparities. In her remarks announcing the working group, Jasmine was gracious but firm. "This isn't about partisan politics or personal conflicts," she said. "This is about ensuring that federal infrastructure investments serve all Americans equitably, regardless of race, income, or zip code. I'm pleased that we now have a formal mechanism to address these critical issues." Privately, however, she remained skeptical about whether the working group would produce meaningful change. In a conversation with her chief of staff, she expressed concerns about whether the process would be substantive or merely symbolic. "They're hoping this will make the story go away," she told Andre, "but we're going to hold them accountable for real action. The communities we're fighting for can't afford another round of committee hearings that lead nowhere." Her skepticism proved partially justified. The working group's initial meetings were marked by political posturing and attempts by some members to minimize the scope of the disparities Jasmine had documented. However, her meticulous preparation and the continued media attention on the issue prevented the group from being dismissed as mere political theater. The working group's first public hearing, held 6 weeks after the original confrontation, drew national attention. Jasmine presented an expanded version of her original research, now including data from all 50 states and detailed case studies from dozens of affected communities. Her presentation was masterful, methodical, fact-based, and impossible to dismiss. She showed maps, charts, and graphs that made the patterns of discrimination undeniable. She read letters from constituents describing the real-world impact of infrastructure neglect. She presented economic analyses showing how the disparities cost taxpayers money while failing to serve the communities with the greatest needs. But the most powerful moment came when she addressed the elephant in the room, the circumstances that had led to the working group's formation. "Some have suggested," she said, looking directly at the cameras, "that this process was created as a result of a political conflict or personal animosity. That's not true. This process exists because American citizens deserved better than what they were getting from their federal government. The data speaks for itself. The needs are documented. The solutions are achievable." She paused, her voice taking on the tone that had made her response to Vance so memorable. "Whether any individual belongs in any particular room is irrelevant. What matters is whether we belong to a country that provides equal treatment and equal opportunity to all its citizens. That's what this is really about." The hearing resulted in unanimous bipartisan support for a preliminary set of recommendations that would form the basis for Jasmine's Infrastructure Equity Act. Even members who had initially been skeptical of her allegations found themselves unable to argue with the comprehensive evidence she had assembled. 6 months after that closed-door confrontation in the Dirksen building, the Infrastructure Equity Act was signed into law with overwhelming bipartisan support. The legislation established new requirements for demographic impact assessments, created transparency mechanisms for federal spending, and mandated regular audits to ensure equitable allocation of resources. More importantly, it allocated $50 billion specifically for infrastructure improvements in historically underserved communities. Jackson, Mississippi received $2.3 billion to completely overhaul its water system. Communities across Louisiana, Texas, Alabama, and other states with documented infrastructure disparities received federal support that had been denied for decades. In her remarks at the bill signing ceremony, Jasmine reflected on the journey from that confrontational briefing to the historic legislation. 6 months ago, I was told I didn't belong in a room where decisions about federal infrastructure spending were being made, she said. Today, we've changed how those decisions get made, ensuring that they serve all Americans equally. She concluded with the words that had defined her throughout the process. Democracy works best when everyone belongs in the room where decisions are made. This legislation ensures that the voices of all communities, regardless of race, income, or political power, will be heard in discussions about federal infrastructure investment. The incident had transformed Jasmine from a relatively unknown congressman into a national figure, and had forced a reckoning with systematic inequities that had persisted for generations. More importantly, it had demonstrated that individual courage, backed by solid data and unwavering principle, could challenge entrenched systems and produce meaningful change. As she left the White House after the signing ceremony, Jasmine was approached by a reporter who asked whether she had any regrets about how the confrontation with Vance had unfolded. Her answer was immediate and definitive. "My only regret is that it took so long for someone to speak up. The communities we've helped through this legislation have been neglected for decades. If one uncomfortable conversation in one room could begin to address that neglect, then it was a conversation worth having." The weeks following the Infrastructure Equity Act signing ceremony brought unexpected developments that would further cement Jasmine Crockett's legacy as a transformative figure in American politics. What had begun as a single confrontation in a closed-door meeting had evolved into a national movement, inspiring similar accountability efforts across multiple levels of government. The first sign that the impact would extend far beyond infrastructure came when state legislatures across the country began introducing their own equity auditing measures. California passed the Crockett Standards, requiring demographic impact assessments for all state spending over $10 million. Texas, despite its conservative legislature, approved a bipartisan measure mandating transparency in state infrastructure allocations after constituents in rural counties discovered they had been systematically underfunded compared to suburban districts. Even more surprising was the international attention Jasmine's approach began receiving. The European Union's Parliament invited her to testify about democratic accountability mechanisms, while the African Union requested her expertise in developing oversight frameworks for their infrastructure initiatives. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau personally called to discuss how similar equity auditing could be implemented in Canadian federal spending. During this period, Jasmine received a call that would reshape her understanding of the broader implications of her work. Dr. James Patterson, a political scientist at Yale University who had been studying democratic institutions for 3 decades, reached out with findings from his research team's analysis of the Vance incident. "Representative Crockett," Dr. Patterson explained during their video conference, "we've been analyzing the long-term effects of your confrontation with the Vice President, and the results are remarkable. We're seeing measurable changes in how closed-door government meetings are conducted, not just at the federal level, but in state capitals and even city councils across the country." He pulled up a presentation showing data from hundreds of government meetings recorded before and after the incident. Meeting participants are asking more substantive questions, demanding more detailed data, and challenging assumptions that previously went unexamined. Your example has created what we're calling the Crockett effect, a new standard for accountability in government deliberations. The research revealed that the leaked audio had done more than expose one problematic exchange. It had fundamentally altered expectations about how government officials should conduct themselves in private settings. Knowing that their words could potentially become public, officials were becoming more careful, more professional, and more substantive in their discussions. This behavioral change extended to the media as well. Investigative journalists began focusing more intensively on closed-door government processes, filing more Freedom of Information Act requests, and developing better sources within government agencies. The result was a new level of transparency that made it harder for officials to operate with the impunity that had characterized much of Washington politics. Jasmine's influence was also being felt in unexpected ways within the Republican Party. a group of Republican congresswomen, led by Representatives Liz Cheney and Elise Stefanik, began privately meeting to discuss how their party could better address issues of equity and inclusion without abandoning core conservative principles. The group, which became known informally as the Accountability Caucus, invited Jasmine to speak at one of their gatherings. The meeting, held in a private dining room at the Capitol Hill Club, was unprecedented in its candid discussion of how racial and economic disparities affected Republican constituents as well as Democratic ones. "Representative Crockett," said Congresswoman Nancy Mace from South Carolina, "your work on infrastructure equity has shown us something important. Rural communities in my district, predominantly white conservative voters, are facing the same kinds of federal neglect that you documented in minority urban areas. We need to find ways to address these disparities that don't get caught up in partisan divisions." The conversation led to unexpected bipartisan collaboration on several pieces of legislation. The Rural-Urban Infrastructure Parity Act, co-sponsored by Jasmine and Representative Mace, created a framework for ensuring that federal transportation dollars served both neglected urban communities and isolated rural areas. The bill passed with overwhelming support, demonstrating that equity-focused policy could transcend traditional political divides. Perhaps the most significant long-term impact of Jasmine's confrontation with Vance emerged in American legal education. Law schools across the country began incorporating the incident into their curricula as a case study in effective advocacy and institutional challenge. Harvard Law School's professor Rebecca Martinez developed an entire course called Speaking Truth to Power, Legal Advocacy in Democratic Institutions that used Jasmine's preparation methods and presentation style as a model for students. What Representative Crockett demonstrated, Professor Martinez explained to her students, was the power of combining meticulous research with moral clarity and strategic communication. She didn't just present data. She told a story that made the human impact of policy decisions impossible to ignore. The case study approach spread to business schools as well, where Jasmine's methods were analyzed as examples of effective organizational change management. MBA programs began teaching the Crockett model of institutional reform: thorough preparation, principled confrontation, strategic follow-through, and sustained pressure for systemic change. The personal cost of her sudden prominence was something Jasmine had not fully anticipated. The constant media attention, speaking requests, and political pressure created strains that affected both her family life and her ability to serve her constituents effectively. Her mother, watching her daughter navigate the intense scrutiny, worried about the long-term impact on Jasmine's well-being. "Baby," her mother said during one of their weekly phone calls, "I'm proud of what you've accomplished, but I'm concerned about you. This level of attention isn't sustainable forever. You need to think about what comes next." The question of what comes next was being asked by political observers across the country. Speculation about Jasmine's future political ambitions intensified, with some suggesting she should run for Senate, others proposing a gubernatorial campaign, and a few even mentioning her as potential presidential material. But Jasmine remained focused on the immediate work at hand. The Infrastructure Equity Act had created new oversight mechanisms, but implementation would require constant vigilance to ensure that the new requirements weren't watered down by bureaucratic resistance or political pressure. She established the Community Infrastructure Monitor, a nonprofit organization dedicated to tracking implementation of the new equity requirements and providing technical assistance to communities seeking federal infrastructure support. The organization was funded by small donations from individuals inspired by her work, demonstrating the grassroots support her efforts had generated. The Monitor's first major success came when it documented attempts by the Department of Transportation to circumvent the new demographic impact assessment requirements. Working with investigative journalists, the organization exposed how some federal agencies were using technical loopholes to avoid conducting meaningful equity analyses. The revelation led to congressional hearings where Jasmine once again found herself presenting evidence of institutional resistance to reform. This time, however, the dynamic was different. She was no longer an outsider challenging the system. She was a recognized expert whose recommendations carried significant weight with both lawmakers and agency officials. The pattern we're seeing, she testified before the House Oversight Committee, is predictable resistance to meaningful change. Agencies are complying with the letter of the law while undermining its spirit. This is exactly why we need independent oversight and regular auditing to ensure that equity requirements are being implemented effectively. Her testimony led to strengthened enforcement mechanisms and larger budgets for oversight activities. More importantly, it demonstrated that her initial confrontation with Vance had been just the beginning of a sustained effort to transform how federal resources were allocated. The international impact of Jasmine's work continued to grow as well. The United Nations invited her to serve on a special committee examining infrastructure equity in developing nations. Her methods for documenting disparities and building coalitions for reform were being adapted by advocacy organizations in countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Dr. Amina Hassan, a policy researcher at the University of Cape Town who had studied Jasmine's approach, explained the global significance. Representative Crockett has demonstrated that individual courage, combined with systematic documentation and strategic communication, can challenge entrenched power structures even in the most established democracies. Her model is being replicated by advocates worldwide who are fighting for equitable resource allocation in their own countries. The ripple effects of that 6-word exchange, "You don't belong in this room," continued to expand in ways that no one could have predicted. Graduate students were writing dissertations about it. Documentary filmmakers were producing features about the confrontation and its aftermath. Even Hollywood began developing projects inspired by Jasmine's story. But perhaps the most meaningful measure of impact came from the communities that had benefited from the infrastructure investments her advocacy had secured. In Jackson, Mississippi, the new water treatment facilities were finally providing residents with clean, reliable drinking water. In Louisiana's Iberia Parish, upgraded electrical infrastructure was ending the chronic power outages that had plagued the community for decades. Maria Gonzalez, the Iberia Parish resident who had been interviewed during the initial controversy, sent Jasmine a handwritten letter that captured the human significance of the policy changes. "My granddaughter can now do her homework at night because we have reliable electricity. My neighbors don't have to worry about boiling water before they drink it. You fought for us when no one else would, and you won. We will never forget what you did." Letters like Maria's arrived daily at Jasmine's office, providing constant reminders of why the confrontation with Vance had been necessary and worthwhile. Each story reinforced her conviction that challenging power structures was not just politically advantageous, but morally imperative. The true measure of her success would not be found in the awards she received or the recognition she earned, but in the communities across America where children could finally drink clean water, families had reliable electricity, and citizens could trust that their government would serve them equitably. That was the legacy of a moment when one person refused to accept that she didn't belong in a room where decisions about their lives were being made. What do you think about Jasmine Crockett's fearless stand against systemic racism in federal spending? Should more politicians follow her example of speaking truth to power, even when told they don't belong? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know what other infrastructure inequities you've witnessed in your community. Subscribe and hit that notification bell to stay updated on political courage that challenges the system. Your voice matters in demanding equal treatment for all Americans.